Welcome to Cafe Tales, where every story is a new mystery. Waiting to be solved, grab a coffee, stay curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started, Sherlock Holmes and The Case of the Final Portrait. Chapter 1. A Matter of Perspective. The November of 1887 was marked by a succession of particularly dense fogs that seemed to transform our beloved London into a city of shadows and half-formed shapes. It was during one such morning that Sherlock Holmes and I encountered what I must count among the most singular cases of our long association. The peculiar events I'm about to relate tested not only my friend's remarkable deductive powers but also challenged our very understanding of what is possible within the bounds of natural law. I had risen early that morning to find Holmes already deeply engrossed in one of his chemical experiments. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street was heavy with the acrid smell of his latest investigation, something to do with the detection of certain alkaloids, though I confessed the precise nature of his research escaped me. The coal fire had burned low, and Mrs. Hudson had not yet arrived with breakfast, leaving the room in that particular state of comfortable disarray that Holmes seemed to prefer for his scientific pursuits. While my friend bent over his apparatus, occasionally noting observations in his precise hand, I occupied myself with the morning's time, particularly interested in a series of articles concerning recent developments in medical science. The fog outside our windows had reduced the street to little more than vague shapes and muffled sounds, the occasional clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones seeming to come from somewhere far more distant than Baker Street below. It was in this peaceful scene that we were suddenly interrupted by an urgent hammering at our door. The violence of the knocking caused even Holmes to look up from his work, one eyebrow raised in that characteristic expression of mild interest that often heralded the beginning of a new case. "A young man," Holmes remarked, returning to his test tube, "and one who has traveled some distance through the fog to reach us. Artist's materials cling to his clothing, unless I am much mistaken." Before I could inquire how he'd drawn these conclusions from mere footsteps on our stairs, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman who proved Holmes right on all counts. He was indeed young, perhaps no more than 25, dressed in the somewhat affected style favored by London's artistic community. His elegant frock coat and carefully arranged cravat spoke of means, yet both showed signs of having been hastily donned. His top hat, which here moved with trembling hands, revealed a shock of auburn hair, styled in the latest artistic fashion. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice quavering with barely suppressed emotion, "I am James Whitmore, assistant to the painter Gerald Blackwood, sir. I fear something terrible has happened at the studio." Holmes's keen eyes swept over our visitor, taking in every detail in that remarkable way of his. "You've come directly from Chelsea, I see, and you've been handling oil paints recently, cadmium yellow, if I'm not mistaken." Whitmore started visibly, his already pale face showing even greater alarm. "Why, yes. But how could you possibly? The slight yellow beneath your fingernails has a particular hue unique to that pigment," Holmes interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Moreover, the distinctive clay of the Chelsea streets clings to your boots, and the fresh spatters suggest you walked at least part of the way in your haste to reach us. Pray continue with your story." "It's Mr. Blackwood, sir. This morning I found him." Here Whitmore's voice faltered, and he had to steady himself against the back of my chair. "Found him dead in his studio. But it's not just the death, Mr. Holmes. It's the painting, his final work. You must see it for yourself. I dare not say more." Holmes's eyebrows arched slightly at these words, and he set aside his chemical apparatus with deliberate care. "Indeed, Watson, if you would be so good as to accompany me. It seems we have a matter worthy of our attention. Though do bring your revolver. These artistic types can be unpredictable." The fog had thickened considerably by the time our hansom deposited us before a handsome Queen Anne house in Chelsea. The building stood slightly back from the street, its red brick facade appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist, like some ghostly magic lantern show. As we followed Whitmore up the steps, I observed Holmes's gaze lingering on the distinctive brass doorknob, though its significance escaped me. At the time, the studio occupied the entire top floor its large north-facing windows admitting a diffuse light that did little to dispel the gloom within. The space was exactly what one might expect of a successful artist's workplace easel, scattered about supporting canvases in various states of completion tables, laden with palettes and brushes and that distinctive smell of oil paint and turpentine that seems universal to all artists. Studio's Gerald Blackwood lay sprawled before his easel, a palette still clutched in his lifeless hand. He was a man of middle years dressed in a paint-stained smoke, his silver hair wild about his head. But it was the canvas before him that drew our immediate attention, a self-portrait of extraordinary detail, showing the artist in the exact position in which he now lay dead remarkable. Holmes murmured, producing his lens and beginning a careful examination of the scene. Watson, your medical opinion, if you please. And do be careful not to disturb the paint tray by the artist's left foot. As I bent to examine the body, I heard the distant toll of church bells, marking the hour, aware that they were chiming the beginning of one of our most Byzantine investigations. The fog pressed against the studio windows, as if nature herself sought to peer in at the extraordinary scene before us. A dead artist, a prophetic painting, and a mystery that would test the limits of Holmes's deductive powers looking back. Now I realized that even then, in those first moments of the investigation, Holmes had already observed several crucial details that would ultimately lead us to the truth. But at the time, like the fog outside, everything was shrouded in uncertainty, and we stood at the threshold of what would prove to be one of the most remarkable cases in all my years of chronicling Holmes's adventures. Chapter 2. The colors of deception. Having completed my examination of Gerald Blackwood's body, straightened up my knees, protesting slightly against the cold studio floor. The curious mark Holmes had indicated beneath the victim's left hand proved to be a small, perfectly circular impression in the wood, as if something round had been pressed there with considerable force. I was about to comment on this when Holmes's voice drew my attention. The paint on his collar. Watson, you noted its peculiar angle. Most observant, he was standing by the large north-facing windows, now his tall figure silhouetted against the foggy light. Tell me, what do you make of the palette itself? I carefully examined the palette still clutched in Blackwood's right hand. The colors are arranged in a rather unusual fashion, not at all how an artist typically sets his paints. And there's something odd about the consistent, precisely. Holmes moved with sudden energy, crossing to one of the many easels that populated the studio. Mr. Whitmore, was it usual for Mr. Blackwood to receive visitors after dark? The assistant, who had been hovering nervously near the door, started at being addressed. No, sir. He was most particular about his lighting, said he couldn't work with artificial illumination. Something about the gaslights affecting his perception of color. He was quite adamant about it. And yet Holmes paused before a small side table, lifting what appeared to be a calling card to the light. Therish cream-colored paper bore an elaborate monogram that I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. Most interesting, the dried mud on the corner of this card suggests it was delivered last evening well after sunset. Watson, you estimated the time of death between 9 and 11 in last night. I confirmed, judging by the level of rigor mortis and the other signs I noted. The chemical odor I detected suggests yes, Holmes interrupted, though not unkindly. The chemical aspect is most illuminating, but let us not get ahead of ourselves. He turned back to Whitmore. I should like a complete list of anyone who had access to Mr. Blackwood's supplies, his paints, his canvases, his chemical materials, everything chemical materials. Whitmore looked puzzled. Well, he did keep a locked cabinet of supplies there in the corner. He'd been experimenting with some new techniques lately. And of course, there was his regular supplier, though I don't handle those arrangements myself. And this painting, gestured to the eerily prophetic self-portrait before which Blackwood lay, what was to be its fate, why it was commissioned by Lord Pembroke, sir, to be unveiled at the Royal Academy's winter exhibition. Mr. Blackwood was quite excited about it, said it would revolutionize the art world, indeed. Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against his chin, a habit Ick knew well from our many cases together then. Perhaps we should pay his lordship a visit. But first he bent, suddenly retrieving something from beneath a cloth-draped table. Watson observed this brush. Notice anything peculiar? I took the proffered brush, examining it carefully. It appeared to be a perfectly ordinary sable brush, the kind commonly used by artists. I can detect nothing unusual about it. Home. It seems to be a standard brush, though perhaps newer than the others. I see about the studio precisely. Holmes's smile was enigmatic, and therein lies our first true clue. Mr. Whitmore, when did Blackwood acquire this particular brush? I'm not certain, the assistant admitted. He was rather particular about his brushes, but I don't recall seeing that one before. Holmes nodded as if this confirmed something in his mind. He moved to examine the painting more closely, his lens catching what little light filtered through the fog-shrouded windows. I watched as he scrutinized the canvas, particularly the areas around the figure of Blackwood himself. Most remarkable, he murmured, the handling of the paint here around the shoulders. Watson, your medical eye might appreciate this. Do you see how the brush strokes change character in this area? I joined him at the easel, noting what he indicated. Indeed, there was a subtle but distinct difference in how the paint had been applied in certain areas. The strokes become more hesitant, hair almost tremulous, rather unlike the confident technique shown in the rest of the painting. Exactly so, and note that the direction of the strokes most illuminating. Holmes straightened up, pocketing his lens. Mr. Whitmore, one final question. Before we depart, the chemical cabinet you mentioned, who has the key? Only Mr. Blackwood kept Isa. He was most insistent about that. Was he indeed? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. And yet I observe that the lock has been recently oiled, though there's a distinct accumulation of dust around the keyhole. Curious, wouldn't you say? As we descended the stairs from the studio, I could contain my curiosity no longer. Holmes, don't you think? Not yet. Watson, we are still gathering data, though I must say, the chemical odor you noted and that peculiar mark on the floorboard do suggest a rather interesting possibility. He paused at the front door, examining the brass knob that had caught his attention earlier. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about the victim's right hand, the one holding the palette? Only that the position seemed somewhat unnatural. As he mentioned, yes, but did you observe the slight discoloration between the thumb and forefinger? Most suggestive. Holmes pulled on his gloves as we stepped out into the fog. Bound Street. Now I believe we have an appointment with Lord Pembroke, though I suspect we shall find his lordship's involvement in this affair to be rather different than it appears. A hansom cab materialized out of the fog at Holmes's signal, and as we climbed in, I reflected that the mystery seemed to be deepening rather than clarifying. The dead artist, the prophetic painting, the curious chemical cabinet, and now this business with Lord Pembroke. How did it all connect? But I knew from long experience that Holmes would reveal his thoughts only when he was ready, and not a moment before. Chapter 3. A study in shadows. Lord Pembroke's Mayfair residence stood in marked contrast to the artistic disarray of Blackwood studio. The morning fog had begun to lift as our hansom deposited us before an imposing townhouse, its white stone facade gleaming wetly in the strength. In sunlight, the neighborhood spoke of old money and established position, with its broad streets and carefully maintained gardens, so different from the bohemian quarter we had just left, as we were shown into his lordship's study by an impeccably dressed butler. I noticed Holmes's attention fix immediately upon a letter written in what appeared to be Japanese characters lying partially visible beneath some papers on the massive desk. The study itself was a testament to refined taste and considerable wealth. Leather-bound volumes in rich browns and deep reds lined the walls, their gilt lettering catching the light that streamed through tall windows. A massive desk of polished mahogany dominated the room, its surface organized with military precision, all except for that one corner where the Japanese letter lay, partially concealed. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, dispelling the last of the morning's chill. Lord Pembroke himself was occupied with his morning correspondence when we entered, his silver pen scratching across expensive paper. He was a tall man, elegantly dressed in the latest fashion, with the carefully cultivated appearance of an artistic patron who wished to seem more bohemian than his aristocratic background might suggest. Ah, the infamous portrait, Lord Pembroke said after we had explained our presence. He settled into his chair before continuing. Poor Blackwood, a genuine talent, though somewhat unstable. In recent weeks, he remarked with a dismissive wave of his well-manicured hand. Unstable in what way? Holmes inquired, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he settled into one of the leather armchairs before the desk. I noticed his gaze kept returning to the Japanese letter, though he made no immediate mention of it every time his eyes moved in that direction. Lord Pembroke's hand would twitch almost imperceptibly. He became increasingly obsessed with certain technical experiments. Lord Pembroke moved to the sideboard, where a crystal decanter caught the morning light. He poured himself a glass of sherry without offering us any. A subtle breach of etiquette that caused my friend's eyebrow to lift slightly. Something about advancing the drying time of oils, consulted frequently with a chemical supplier, a Thaddeus Grove. I believe the name was quite out of character for him to involve himself in such technical matters. Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. Did he mention the nature of these experiments, my dear fellow? I'm a pawn of the arts, not a practitioner, though. Lord Pembroke paused, frowning as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The morning light through the windows cast strange shadows across his face. He did say something rather odd at our last meeting. Something about achieving immortality through his work. Pure artist fancy. I assumed at the time this last meeting, Holmes said carefully, leaning forward, slightly in his chair. When did it take place? 3 days ago, here in this very room. He seemed quite agitated. Lord PMR's hand moved with studied casualness to cover the Japanese letter more completely with other papers. The movement might have seemed natural to most observers, but I had learned to recognize when my friend's attention was particularly engaged, and his eyes narrowed slightly at this gesture. I see you maintain correspondence with Japan. My Lord Holmes's tone was carefully neutral, but I could detect the keen interest beneath his casual inquiry. A slight flush appeared high on Lord Pembroke's cheeks. Ah, you noticed. He replied, his own tone equally studied. A personal letter from a friend. Nothing to do with this unfortunate business, I assure you. His fingers drummed once on the desk before he caught himself and stilled them. And the portrait itself, you commissioned it for the Royal Academy's winter exhibition. Holmes smoothly changed the subject, though I knew him well enough to recognize that he had noted every nuance of Lord Pembroke's reaction. Yes, though, I'm beginning to wonder if that was wise. Blackwood's reputation for eccentricity was growing. There was some talk in artistic circles about his unusual methods. Unusual in what way? Holmes inquired. Oh, technical matters mostly, are something about his new approach to oils. The art dealer Thornton seemed particularly concerned about it. Said Blackwood was becoming unreliable. Lord Pembroke had regained his composure now, but his eyes kept straying to the corner of his desk where the Japanese letter lay hidden as we took our leave. I noticed Holmes had become unusually quiet, his brow furrowed, in that way that told me he was deep in thought. The fog had lifted entirely, now leaving behind a crisp autumn day that seemed somehow at odds with the dark mystery we were investigating. The morning sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement, not unlike the shadows that seemed to be gathering around this peculiar case. What are you thinking, Holmes? I ventured as we walked toward Piccadilly, our footsteps echoing on the fashionable street. I am thinking, Watson, that we must pay a visit to Mr. Grove's establishment. He paused to light his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the morning light, but I suspect we shall find his establishment most enlightening. The Japanese letter seemed to interest you greatly. I said, yes, though perhaps not for the reasons you might think. Did you observe how quickly his lordship moved to conceal it? Most suggestive. Holmes puffed thoughtfully, this pipe sending rings of smoke into the clear air. But we get ahead of ourselves first. Let us see what Mr. Grove has to tell us about Blackwood's experiments as we made our way toward Clerkenwell. I couldn't help but feel that the case was becoming more complex rather than less. The dead artist, the prophetic painting, the curious experiments, the hastily concealed letter. How did it all connect? But I knew Holmes well enough to recognize that he was already forming theories, though as usual he would keep them to himself until he had gathered all the necessary evidence. Chapter 4: The Chemistry of Art. Mr. Grove's chemical supply shop occupied a narrow building in Clarendon wedged between a bookbinder's workshop and a printer's establishment. The interior proved to be a curious mixture of laboratory and warehouse with shelves reaching to the ceiling. Laden with bottles and jars of every description, the air held a complex mixture of odors that reminded me forcibly of the strange chemical smell I had detected around Blackwood's body. The proprietor, Thaddeus Grove, proved to be a thin, nervous man with acid-stained fingers and peculiar circular marks on his spectacles that I recognized as the kind left by protective goggles. He adjusted these spectacles constantly. Ash spoke a habit that seemed to increase with his evident anxiety at our questioning Mr. Blackwood. Oh yes, most particular about his requirements, Grove said, shuffling through a leather-bound ledger. Always insisted on preparing certain mixtures himself. Had his own formulas. You see, most unusual for an artist to show such interest in the chemical properties of his materials. Holmes examined the ledger with evident interest, his finger tracing down columns of neat entries. These quantities seem unusually large for an artist's requirements. 5 lb of linseed oil accelerant in a single week. And this notation here about cadmium compounds. He spoke of a special commission, something about achieving unprecedented effects. Grove hesitated, his fingers working nervously at his spectacles again. I tried to warn him about the dangers of certain combinations, but he wouldn't listen. Said he was under pressure to complete the work, quickly pressure. From whom? Holmes asked sharply. Grove's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles once more. I shouldn't say. There were several interested parties. An art dealer had been making inquiries about his new technique. The man became quite insistent about. He broke off suddenly, realizing he'd said too much. This art dealer, Holmes pressed his keen eyes fixed on Grove's nervous face. He would be Mr. Thornton. Perhaps. Grove started violently at the name. I really shouldn't. Come, Mr. Grove, Holmes said quietly. You've already indicated his involvement. Better to tell us what you know. Now the chemist seemed to deflate slightly. Yes, Mr. Thornton. He and Mr. Blackwood had several disagreements. They quarreled here in the shop last week. I didn't mean to overhear, but their voices were raised. Something about exclusive rights to a new technique these accelerate. Holmes said, returning to the ledger. They would produce most unusual effects when combined with certain oils, would they? Not, oh yes, he developed some method of making oil paintings dry in hours rather than days. Quite remarkable. Really, though, potentially dangerous if one doesn't understand the chemical principles involved. The wrong combination of accelerants could produce, well, most unfortunate effects. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. These are unfortunate effects. Would they include any particular physical symptoms? I couldn't say for certain. Grove replied, though his increased fidgeting suggested otherwise, though. He did warn him about proper ventilation. Some of these compounds, when mixed with certain oils, indeed. Holmes suddenly turned his attention to a shelf behind the counter. Those circular marks on your spectacles, they match precisely with these protective goggles here. You've been conducting some experiments of your own? Perhaps. Grove's hand flew to his spectacles. Well, yes, one must verify the safety of new compounds. Professional responsibility. You understand. As we left the shop, Holmes suddenly stopped. At the corner of the street, Watson. What do you recall about the position of the palette in relation to the painting? The palette, why it was… I frowned, trying to recall the exact details. Actually, I'm not entirely certain, though I remember thinking the position seemed unnatural for an artist at work. Exactly. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light that told me he was following a promising line of inquiry. And now I believe we should have a word with Mr. Thornton, though first I must send a telegram regarding certain chemical properties of cadmium yellow. He consulted his watch. The laboratory at St. Bartholomew's should still be open. Holmes, surely you don't think Grove was involved in Blackwood's death? Think, Watson, those protective goggles, the nervous manner, the extensive knowledge of potentially dangerous compounds. It's all suggestive, wouldn't you say, yet not conclusive. No, there's something else at work here, something about those quantities in the ledger, large amounts of materials, not just the amounts, Watson, but the timing. Note that the purchases increased dramatically 3 weeks ago. Precisely when Lord Pembroke commissioned the portrait, and yet he paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. The paint on Blackwood's collar, the position of the palette. Those curious marks on the floorboards, they suggest something altogether different. A hansom cab clattered past, splashing through a puddle left by the morning's fog. Holmes seemed lost in thought, his finger tapping against his chin in that characteristic gesture I knew so well, that formula Lord Pembroke showed us. He mused it was incomplete deliberately, so I suspect, but why and what of Thornton's interest in the technique an art dealer concerned with chemical processes seems somewhat out of character, wouldn't you say? Before I could respond, Holmes had hailed a passing cab to the telegraph office. He instructed the driver simply, once we were settled in the hansom. He turned to me. Then we shall proceed. To Bond Street, Mr. Thornton's gallery should be open by now, and I believe he may have some interesting insights into the relationship between art and chemistry. As we rattle through the London streets, I couldn't help but feel that we were approaching some crucial understanding. The chemical aspects of the case seemed to be taking precedence over the artistic, yet I knew Holmes well enough to trust that all these seemingly disparate threads would eventually weave together into a coherent whole chapter. 5. The art dealer's tale. After dispatching his telegram to send Bartholomew's laboratory, Holmes led us through the fashionable streets of Bond Street, where London's finest art galleries displayed their treasures behind gleaming plate glass windows. Reginald Thornton's establishment proved to be one of the most impressive, its elegant facade speaking of considerable success in his trade. The interior matched the promise of its exterior, with several well-appointed rooms displaying paintings that even my untutored eye could recognize as valuable. A clerk informed us that Mr. Thornton was extremely occupied with urgent business, but Holmes's card produced an almost immediate effect. The man himself matched his surroundings, expensively dressed, yet with an air of calculated dishevelment that suggested he wished to appear more bohemian than his circumstances indicated. He was consulting his pocket watch. As we entered his private office, a room whose walls were covered with what appeared to be preliminary sketches by various artists, gentlemen, he said curtly, remaining standing behind his desk. I must be brief. I have an important meeting across town in 30 minutes. We shan't keep you long, Holmes replied smoothly, settling uninvited into one of the leather-armed chairs. We're here about Gerald Blackwood. Thornton's expression flickered momentarily. Tragic business, of course, but I really don't see what I can add now. If you'll excuse me. The painting commissioned by Lord Pembroke. Holmes interrupted. You were to handle its sale. I believe I handle many paintings, Mr. Holmes, now, really. I have several pressing appointments. Curious, Holmes mused, that an art dealer of your standing would take such interest in chemical processes. Thornton's hand reaching for some papers on his desk paused almost imperceptibly. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. The technical aspects of painting are naturally of some interest to those in the trade. But come now, Mr. Thornton Blackwood's new technique was causing quite stir in artistic circles, was it not? Rumors and gossip. Thornton glanced at his watch again. Artists are forever claiming revolutionary breakthroughs. 99% of them amount to nothing. Now I really must insist. The brush strokes in his final painting, Holmes, pressed most unusual. Wouldn't you say, particularly around the figure shoulders? I haven't examined the working question. Thornton's voice had grown sharp. And I have a very important client, waiting, more important than the Royal Academy's winter exhibition. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. I understand Blackwood's portrait was to be the centerpiece, as I said. I handle many paintings now, if you've quite finished. He reached for his coat. One final question, Holmes said. Rising the Japanese art market, quite lucrative, I understand. Thornton paused, his coat half on. I really couldn't say. My dealings are primarily European. Good day, gentlemen. As we descended the gallery's elegant staircase, I noticed Holmes glanced back thoughtfully at something near Thornton's desk. Before we left, a small Japan box that seemed out of place. Among the artistic clutter outside, the afternoon had grown cold, a bitter wind whipping down Bond Street and setting the carriage horses stamping uneasily. Well, Watson, what did you make of our art dealer? He seemed remarkably eager to be rid of us, indeed. And did you notice anything else peculiar about him? I thought for a moment. His hands, they were perfectly manicured. Yet there was a slight stain between his thumb and forefinger, rather like the mark we observed on Blackwood's hand. Excellent, Watson, and the Japan box I noticed you seemed interested in. Though I couldn't see why, no, consider its location pushed almost out of sight. Behind the desk, yet not quite hidden, and its surface recently cleaned, though dust had accumulated on everything else in the office. Most suggestive, wouldn't you say? Before I could respond, Holmes suddenly hailed a passing cab back to Baker Street. He instructed the driver, though first we must stop at St. Bartholomew's. I expect a most interesting response to my tea about those cadmium compounds as our cab rattled. Through the darkening streets I pondered what we had learned, or rather, what we had failed to learn from our interview with Thornton, his evident anxiety to be rid of us, his careful avoidance of discussing Blackwood's technique, the curious stains on his hands. How did it all connect to the dead artist and that eerily prophetic painting? But Holmes had lapsed into one of his thoughtful silences, and I knew from long experience that he would reveal his theories only when he was ready. The chemical odor I had detected around Blackwood's body seemed to hover in my memory, joining with the image of that unnatural pallet position and the curious marks on the studio floor. Something was beginning to take shape in my mind, though I couldn't quite grasp it. Holmes's expression told me he was several steps ahead as usual, following some trail of evidence that remained invisible to my eyes. Chapter 6. A model stale. Our stop St. Bartholomew proved most enlightening. Holmes spent several minutes examining the laboratory's analysis of the cadmium compounds, his expression growing increasingly intent as he studied the results. Just as I suspected, Watson, he remarked as we left, the particular reaction between these pigments and certain accelerants. Most suggestive, though I shall need to confirm one detail before drawing any firm conclusions. Upon our return to Baker Street that evening, we found a visitor awaiting us in our sitting room. The lady rose as we entered, and I was struck by her evident beauty. Despite the signs of recent distress upon her features, she was dressed in deep mourning, her black garments emphasizing the pallor of her face and the redness around her eyes that spoke of many shed tears. Miss Elena Reed, Mrs. Hudson, announced. Before quietly withdrawing, "Pray be seated," Madam Holmes said gently, gesturing to the chair she had vacated. "You've come about Gerald Blackwood." I perceived the lady started. "How could you know the paint?" "Track is on your glove, madam, the distinctive shade of violet that I observed in Blackwood's studio this morning. An artist's color, and one he was particularly fond of using in his recent portraits." Miss Reed's composure wavered slightly at this reminder. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I was his model. But more than that," her voice faltered. "You were engaged to be married?" Holmes said softly. A tear rolled down her cheek, not officially announced, but "Yes, Gerald, and I. It began with the portraits, you see. He saw something in me that no one else had ever noticed the way he painted me." She withdrew a small photograph from her reticule, passing it to Holmes. "This was his first portrait of me 6 months ago." I leaned over to examine the photograph, even in the monochrome reproduction. The artistry was evident, a masterful study of light and shadow that seemed to capture not just the lady's physical beauty, but something of her inner nature as well. "When did your relationship with Mr. Blackwood begin to change?" Holmes inquired, returning the photograph. 3 months ago, he asked me to sit for another portrait, but this time he talked as he painted about his hopes, his dreams about the future. Hainov envisioned. She twisted her handkerchief in her lap. But then everything changed when he began his experiments. These would be the chemical experiments, Holmes asked. His interest clearly piqued. Yes, he became obsessed with this new technique he was developing, spent hours in his studio, mixing paints and chemicals, said it would revolutionize the art world. She paused, dabbing at her eyes. That's when Mr. Thornton began to show an unusual interest in Gerald's work. Reginald Thornton, the art dealer. Yes, but his interest wasn't just in the paintings. Miss Reed's voice hardened slightly. He began appearing at the studio. During my sittings, making excuses to be there, his attention became uncomfortable. Holmes leaned forward in his chair. "Please be specific, Miss Reed, first." It was subtle compliments, small gifts. I couldn't politely refuse, but then he began suggesting that he could advance my career, introduce me to other artists when I declined. He became more insistent. Gerald noticed and confronted him about it. When was this confrontation? A week ago. I wasn't meant to overhear, but I was changing behind the screen. After a sitting, Thornton was demanding something, a formula. He said Gerald refused, told him to leave and never return. Thornton became angry, said Gerald would regret his decision. I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest. And after this confrontation, Thornton began appearing everywhere I went, exhibition shops even outside my home. It was as if he was watching my every move then. 3 days ago, Gerald told me he had something important to tell me, something about Thornton, but he said it wasn't safe. To discuss it? Then he promised to explain everything after he finished the portrait for Lord Pembroke. Her voice broke. That was the last time I saw him alive. Holmes sat in silence for a moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The paint on your glove suggests you visited the studio this morning before coming here. Yes, Miss Reed's hands trembled slightly. I had to see, had to understand. But that painting, Mr. Holmes, that horrible painting showing his death, how could such a thing be possible? That, madam, is precisely what we must determine. Now, pray tell me, did you notice anything unusual about the chemical cabinet in the studio during your visit? Only that it was open? Gerald always kept it locked. He was very particular about his new materials. Indeed, Holmes exchanged a significant look with me, and the Japan box that usually sat upon it gone. I noticed because Gerald always placed his special brushes there, the ones he used only for his new technique. Holmes rose and began to pace the room. His manner suddenly energetic. Miss Reed, you have provided us with several most illuminating details. I believe I begin to see the outline of events, though much remains to be proved. Has stopped suddenly. One final question, did you observe any unusual odor in the studio this morning? Anything similar to what you might have noticed during your last sitting? Now that you mention it, yes, a strange, sweet smell. Rather like the one I noticed when Gerald was working with his new paints, but stronger after. Miss Reed had taken her leave. I turned to Holmes. Surely this suggests Thornton's guilt, his obsession with Miss Reed, his argument with Blackwood, his suspicious behavior. It suggests many things, Watson. But we must not let emotion cloud our judgment. Though I must say that business about the Japan box, he broke off, reaching for his pipe. We must act quickly now. If I'm right about the chemical aspects of this case, there may be more at stake than a single murder. What do you mean? Consider Watson, a technique that allows oil paintings to dry in hours instead of days. Think of the implications, the potential for forgery alone. He paused, striking a match. Now there are depths to this case we have not yet plumbed, though. I believe our next steps are clear. And those are. Holmes smiled grimly through the pipe smoke. We must pay another visit to Mr. Grove's establishment, though this time, Watson, we shall do so under cover of darkness. Chapter 7. The final stroke. The November night had grown bitterly cold by the time Holmes and I found ourselves in the narrow street behind Grove's chemical shop. A thick fog had descended once again, transforming the gas lamps into dim halos that barely penetrated the gloom. My friend had insisted we wait until well past midnight before proceeding with this phase of his investigation, and I confess the chill had begun to seep through my heaviest coat. You see, Watson, Holmes whispered, as we made our way toward the shop's rear entrance. The chemical analysis from St. Bartholomew's confirmed my suspicions about the particular properties of Blackwood's new technique. But there remains the question of how our murderer obtained certain crucial materials. Surely Grove must have supplied them, perhaps, but consider the quantities noted in his ledger. They don't quite align with what we found in the studio. Do they? The lock on the back door proved little challenge to Holmes's picks, and within moments we were inside the shop's back room. Holmes immediately lit a dark lantern, keeping its beam carefully shielded. The room presented a very different aspect by night, with rows of bottles gleaming dully in the lantern's light, their contents casting strange shadows on the walls. The chemical odors seemed more pronounced in the stillness of the night, reminding me uncomfortably of the scene in Blackwood's studio. Holmes moved with purpose toward a particular cabinet, one we hadn't examined during our previous visit. His fingers traced the edge of its lock, thoughtfully. "Ah," he breathed, examining. "Closely recently opened. You see the oil is still fresh." His lens came out catching what little light was available. And here the same distinctive scratch pattern we observed on the cabinet in Blackwood's studio Holmes. "Surely you don't think quiet." Watson, his hand suddenly gripped my arm. Footsteps could be heard approaching from the street. We dowed the lantern and pressed ourselves into the shadows behind a large wooden cabinet. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the sound of a key turning in the front door lock through the glass panels separating the back room from the shop proper. I could make out a figure moving cautiously through the darkness, just as I expected. Holmes breathed so quietly I could barely hear him, though I confess I didn't anticipate quite such convenient timing. The figure moved into the back room, producing a light of their own. In its dim glow, I recognized Thaddeus Grove, though his nervous manner seemed even more pronounced than usual. He moved to the cabinet. Holmes had been examining his hands, shaking slightly, as he withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. Suddenly a second set of footsteps could be heard. Grove froze, then quickly secreted the notebook in his coat pocket. The new arrival entered without bothering to be quiet, footsteps sharp and purposeful on the wooden floor. Well, the sharp voice of Reginald Thorne cut through the darkness. "Did you find it?" Mr. Thornton Grove's voice quavered. I was just checking some records. Don't play games with me, Grove. You know what I need, the formula. Blackwood's original notes, they must be here somewhere, I've told you. I don't have them, whatever. Blackwood discovered he kept the key details to himself. You're lying. Thornton's voice had grown dangerous. You helped him develop the technique. You must know how it works. I only supplied standard material, the real breakthrough. That was all Blackwood's work. And now that he's dead, yes, Thornton cut in, now that he's dead. You're the only one who might know his secrets. And with that Detective Holmes and his dull-witted doctor friend closing in, we need to move quickly, Groves. Nervous shuffling could be heard in the darkness. What do you mean, I've booked? Passage to Japan. The ship leaves tomorrow at 3. That meddlesome detective is making too much progress. We need to be on that ship, Grove, with Blackwood's formula in hand. Japan. Grove's voice quavered. But surely would you prefer to stay and face the consequences tomorrow? The docks 3 us bring everything, the formula. The notes, all of it we can make, a fortune in Japan where no one will find us. I felt Holmes tense beside, merely to intervene if need. But at that moment, a police whistle sounded in the street outside. Both men started violently. Remember, 3 sewers at the docks. Thornton hissed, "Don't be late, or you'll regret it." The sound of his retreating footsteps was followed by Grove's hurried departure. The fog had thickened further by the time we emerged from our hiding place. Holmes led us swiftly through the maze of streets, his own footsteps sure, despite the poor visibility. It wasn't until we were safely back in our sitting room at Baker Street with a fresh fire blazing in the grate that he finally broke his thoughtful silence. "Well, Watson, what do you make of their planned escape to Japan?" "Surely we must alert Larad immediately, all in good time," my friend Holmes settled into his favorite chair, reaching for his pipe. "Remember, we need more than just flight to prove guilt, though. I must say this development fits perfectly with what the chemical analysis revealed." He paused to puff at his pipe, sending rings of smoke toward the ceiling. "Tell me, what did you make of Grove's notebook? Could it contain Blackwood's formula, that notebook?" No, though its contents are crucial to our case, they're not what Thornton believes them to be. Remember the circular marks on Grove's spectacles, the same marks we found." He broke off suddenly. But we get ahead of ourselves. Tomorrow will be soon enough to set our final trap. Though I think, Watson, you might wish to bring your revolver when we visit the docks. 3 hours should prove a most interesting hour. Indeed, the fire crackled in the grate, as Holmes lapsed into one of his thoughtful silences, though I could see his keen eyes were bright with anticipated action. Whatever he had deduced from the night's events, I knew that tomorrow would bring this strange case to its conclusion. The mystery of the living portrait, that seemingly impossible painting that had predicted its creator's death, was nearly solved. Chapter 8. The Portrait Speaks, the Fog That Had Haunted London. Throughout our investigation had finally lifted by 3 were the following afternoon, revealing a steel-gray sky over the Thames docks. Holmes and Iastra, accompanied by several of Scotland Yard's most trusted men, had taken up positions among the cargo, crates and warehouses well before the appointed hour. Remember, Holmes had whispered, as we waited, let them make the exchange before moving in. We need proof of both the formula and their intended flight. We did not have long to wait. Grove arrived first, his nervous manner even more pronounced than usual as he clutched a leather portfolio to his chest. Thornton appeared moments later, striding purposefully along the dock with the air of a man who believed himself already safely away. You have it all, Thornton demanded without preamble. Grove nodded jerkily. Everything, the formulas, the notes about the accelerant, excellent. Our ship awaits once we reach Japan. That's quite far enough, gentlemen. Holmes's voice rang out as he stepped from behind a stack of crates. Lads' men emerged from their hiding places, revolvers drawn. What followed was brief but violent. Thornton attempted to flee, nearly reaching the gangplank of a nearby steamer, before 2 constables tackled him to the rough planks of the dock. Grove, showing more wisdom, surrendered immediately, once both men were securely bound. Holmes turned to Thornton with that peculiar smile I had seen so often at the conclusion of a case. A clever scheme, Mr. Thornton, though perhaps too clever by half. The painting that predicted its creator's death, a masterful touch designed to suggest something supernatural rather than criminal. Thornton maintained a stony silence, but Grove had begun to tremble visibly. Come. Now, Lestrade said, drawing his revolver and leveling it at Grove, one of you would better start talking. Grove broke immediately. It was all his idea, he burst out, nodding toward Thornton. He paid me to modify Blackwood's materials, specific compounds of cadmium mixed with the oils. Said it would teach the artist a lesson. Shut up, you fool. Thornton snailed, but Grove was beyond stopping. He had me alter the chemical composition gradually over weeks. The modifications to the oils, the accelerants, all designed to create specific effects when combined. Didn't know he meant to kill anyone, I thought. It was just about ruining Blackwood's reputation. Holmes nodded. The chemical analysis from St. Bartholomew's confirmed the presence of these modified compounds. But it was about more than just the artist's reputation, wasn't it? Mr. Thornton's face had taken on an ugly expression. That pompous fool. He had everything, talent, recognition. And his voice broke slightly. Miss Reed. I offered her the world, connections, opportunities, but she only had eyes for him and his wretched paintings, so you conceived a plan. Holmes continued. First, discredit Blackwood with a seemingly impossible painting that predicted its creator's death. The fast-drying oils would make it appear the painting was completed before his death, when in fact, I interjected, finally seeing the pattern. The painting was done under duress shortly before the murder. Precisely what? Yes. And those same chemicals produced the distinct odor you noticed at the crime scene. Watson, the whole scheme required weeks of preparation, gradually modifying Blackwood's materials, arranging the commission through Lord Pembroke, all leading to that final night when you forced him to paint his own death scene before murdering him. Lestrade signaled his men to take the prisoners away. Thornton, his composure completely shattered, began shouting about missed opportunities and betrayal. Grove simply wept. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his favorite chair, contemplating the fire. Through a cloud of pipe smoke, there's one thing I still don't understand, I said. Why did Thornton need to flee to Japan specifically? Holmes smiled. Think what? Where better to hide a stolen formula for fast-drying oils than in a country famous for its own ancient techniques? If he could have sold Blackwood's discovery as a rediscovered Oriental secret. The forged letter and print were merely the first steps in establishing that connection. A remarkable case, Holmes. Indeed, though I suspect Miss Reed will find some comfort in knowing that justice has been served. He tapped out his pipe thoughtfully. You know, Watson, there's a curious parallel between art and crime. Both require technique, preparation, and a certain creative vision. The difference lies purely in the moral dimension of their execution and in the fact that crime, unlike art, must eventually answer to justice. I added, precisely, my dear Watson, Precisely, thank you for tuning in to Cafe Story. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense bees, sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.